Excellent, thank you. Um, so thanks so much for the invite to talk about this. I'm really happy to share my thoughts on this, but I would note that obviously we all have a lot more to learn about impact, or I certainly do. I have been involved in authoring an impact case study for the last ref, which I'll mention later. And a lot of what we do in SIPR is about hopefully facilitating this type of work. So I'd note that a lot of what I'll talk about in this presentation builds on work that I've been doing with Monica Craig and others colleagues at SIPR. And before I started, I just wanted to reflect a little bit like Oona did on, why we're all in these type of jobs. And essentially, I think the way I look at it, the research impact agenda and the evidence-led policing, or whatever context you're working in, agenda may come from different places, whether it's academia or policy and practice context. But the heart of all this, I think there are shared goals around improving services or improving society and making a difference at the end of the day. And I think impact is a good nexus for that. So moving on to talk to you about how SIPR currently facilitates impact. Some of, as a police academic partnership, our mission is to support internationally excellent policing research to enable evidence-informed policy and practice. And some of the activity that we support and our members engage in, sits on a kind of continuum, as I see it, from cooperation through to collaboration and in some cases co-production. Nutley and et al.'s work on this talks about, what works in terms of connecting research to policy and practice. And a key thing here is about supporting sustained routine interactions. And really that's what SIPR and also SCCJR does in terms of connecting academia to policymakers and practitioners and other actors in these ways. So we support this at SIPR through our thematic networks, regular engagements through events and conferences. And as Oona alluded to, knowledge exchange really is about this two-way flow of information where you might be sharing existing research to help shape evidence base, policies and practices, but it's also about understanding practitioner knowledge and what the knowledge gaps are. So as Oona said, this can start earlier on in the process. It's also about having, as I see it, having a seat at the table sometimes helps in terms of knowledge exchange and potential impact. So SIPR has representation on various boards, and we can, through that, as I see it, ask difficult questions. For example, I sit on the drug strategy board, and I chaired an independent advisory group on emerging technologies in policing. So whilst we are academically led at SIPR, some of our grant calls are developed collaboratively or in some cases even co-produced with policing partners. So the hope is that where you're finding knowledge or practice gaps and you're beginning to fill those through research, the research that we're supporting is focused on the needs of the practitioners or policymakers. For example, at SIPR, we have a responsive research fund, which focuses on policing needs being met, as well as more academically led grant calls. We also support academics to cooperate or conduct collaborative research with partners. So moving on to talk a little bit more about knowledge exchange, communication, dissemination. Now, obviously, this isn't, as Oona said, impact, but I think it's important to think about how you can disseminate your work or how you can engage in knowledge exchange, which may lead to impact down the line. So partly it's about brokering, networking and facilitating communication between academia and practitioners. That's a kind of key thing that we try and do at SIPR. Facilitating academic representation or membership on influential reference or advisory groups, as I already mentioned. Supporting researchers to disseminate and communicate their findings in specific ways that are targeted to different audiences. So, for example, it might be podcasts, it might be policy briefings, or we have a range of other ways of doing dissemination and potential potentially delivering impact. In certain projects, we're running World Cafes or online policy roundtables, for example. We deliver a suite of different publications which try and summarize findings in accessible ways. And we also provide financial and administrative support for dissemination activities, and particularly knowledge exchange events. Developing networks and communities expertise is really important. So, for example, through our networks or brokering teams in our networks, there will be practitioners and policymakers sometimes sitting alongside academics, discussing knowledge gaps, discussing what the current evidence base is, and engaging in knowledge exchange. We run knowledge exchange sessions from our conference through to webinars, seminars, to also academic challenge sessions where the police might come up with a certain area that they have some questions around, and we bring together academics to discuss the evidence base and share their research and help to answer some of those questions. We also sit on the Joint Research and Evidence Forum, which is led by Police Scotland and Scottish Police Authority. I'll come back to that later. So moving on then in terms of thinking about documenting impact, and Oona's nicely talked about some of the testimonials and ways that you would be doing this for ref purposes. But ways that we try and capture this to support our members is sharing and recording activities and outputs, for example, in our SIPR annual report, which showcases the great policing research that's going on across Scotland. Looking at SIPR's contribution and how we may have supported ref impact case studies. We introduced a couple of years ago impact awards, SIPR impact awards, which try and showcase some great impact there. And we're leading on a Joint Research and Evidence Forum action, which is on maximising and documenting pathways to impact. So this is important because whilst academics can do a lot to try and design research which is relevant and potentially impactful and do great knowledge exchange, we're trying to work here with policing partners to think about how we can get research to be more embedded in police organisations as a matter of routine. So this would apply to other stakeholders as well. But thinking, for example, the Independent Advisory Group report that we delivered on emerging technologies in policing, one of the recommendations there was that all business cases that go through policing must require an assessment of the evidence base, that research should be used to inform for the rollout of pilots and evaluation. And we're keen to make sure that research evidence is cited not only in business plans, but also in strategy documents, policy decisions, that the policing system is expecting evidence to be considered, but also that there's a role for police partners in providing feedback on how research findings have been received. So here's our research that we did. What's happened within your organisation as a result of that? How has it been received? How have certain events or discussions been received? Are there any potential impacts? And following up and documenting impacts as they emerge and giving practitioners and policymakers a role in that alongside academics. So we're trying to push for more of that. So moving on then to particularly what SIPR can do maybe to support early career researchers. In creating impact, we have an early career researcher category in our SIPR Impact Awards. So our next one of these will be awarded next May or June when we have the next conference. So we'd encourage people to consider putting together a nomination for that for themselves or someone else to really highlight the great impact that's there. We have a postgraduate symposium where PhD students present their work, and from this year we co-created with the Scottish Government a series of lunchtime seminars to highlight some of the postgraduate presentations. We have various publications, as I've mentioned, but particularly InSpec, which is a briefing series for students and postgrads and early career researchers, which is shared with key partners. There's an opportunity to participate in our SIPR podcast, but also we can help with including news and advertising things in our newsletter, through our social media. And we do have the kind of core administrative support to support dissemination and impact processes as required. This is in addition to various other mechanisms and things I've already mentioned. So the reason I'm focusing a lot on SIPR is because, well, I'm heavily involved in that. And obviously there's a lot of other mechanisms that are supported and provided through SCCJR and other organisations, and indeed within your own universities. But I think it kind of just brings life to some of the examples that we're talking through here. So moving on then to just give you an example of I've picked the area of stop and search. So this is an example of the impact of research on policy and practice. I picked this example because I'm familiar with it. I wrote a case study on this, but I would note that there were four, another reason for picking this is that there were four impact case studies across four of the institutions in SIPR, which related to stop and search in the last ref. So as many of you will know, but maybe some of you aren't as familiar, there was some fantastic research done by a PhD student, Kath Murray, whose research showed that the rate of stop and search was 4 times higher in England and Wales, and young people were being disproportionately targeted. There was issues with non-statutory stop and search. I don't have time to go into the details, but these were groundbreaking independent findings, and they were initially met with denial and defensiveness. There was a lot else going on in this context with the recent formation of Police Scotland, and this became a very hot media topic and political issue, which I think is part of a reason that it led to a lot of impact. But in terms of the wider context, there was, quite a weak SPA scrutiny report in 2014, an HMICS report in 2015, which recommended fundamental change, but there was also further academic research funded by SIPR, led by Megan O'Neill at Dundee, which I was involved in from Napier. This was a SIPR-funded evaluation of the Fife pilot, which the report was published in 2015. And we found from this an unusual step, given the context. We received a 34-page report from the police detailing how all 17 recommendations had been or were being actioned by the police to improve practices around stop and search. There was an independent advisory group set up and chaired by John Scott, QC, and this included a lot of academic input, particularly from Susan McVie at Edinburgh and Genevieve Lennon at Strathclyde and others. And all of these different aspects really fed into Police Scotland's implementation plan to legislative change, which resulted in no more in the eradication of the idea of non-statutory stop and search, new legislation in 2016, and the Code of Practice, which came in 2017. There's a huge amount more that could be said about this, but I think what I would say is that the academic research had a key role here, but the timing and the media interest and politics around this can't be underestimated either. So you can do fantastic research and sometimes it just doesn't get picked up, and sometimes the timing is right and it can be really impactful. So just moving on to some other recent examples of impact that is being developed that we're aware of within our SIPR membership. There's many other examples. So I've got 3 examples here, but I would also highlight a SIPR-funded project that was published relatively recently on influence policing. So this was a project funded by SIPR, led by Ben Collier at the University of Edinburgh, and there's a lot of impact that's emerging as a result of that work. But some of the examples I have here, such as the Seldom Heard Communities grants. So this was 5 grants that were funded with researchers from across our members. The call was co-designed with policing colleagues, and the dissemination events, there was a bespoke event to a police audience, and then there was a general open event as well. And these were very well received and are having impacts in this space. There was a SIPR-funded project on the impact of COVID-19 and partnerships between police and GBV service providers in remote, rural and island communities, which received the 2023 SIPR Impact Award, and led by Sarah Peterson at RGU. And there's some clear kind of pathways to impact there, which will hopefully come to fruition. The police carriage of naloxone project evaluation as you can see kind of here from this quote, informed the decision by the Chief Constable to roll out naloxone, which is the antidote to opioid overdose. And sadly, it's been so needed that it has been administered, as of a couple of weeks ago, 520 times. And it received highly commended in the Herald Impact Awards for Research Project of the Year recently. So there's just some examples of recent of impact that is emerging at the moment. There's lots of other examples of previous impact case studies in the last ref, for example, around missing persons, around training of forensic services personnel, where you can see impact case studies related to policing. So moving on, I just wanted to reflect briefly on some of the challenges that I think we need to acknowledge when we're discussing working quite closely, either cooperating, collaborating, or even co-producing research with practitioners and policymakers. There are a lot of challenges, such as high staff turnover and how that challenges building relationships and trust. There's things to watch out for around power relations and differing interests. And, all of this is particularly the case when you're running police to academic partnerships or other practitioner policymaker partnerships. But it can also apply when you're talking about individual research projects, etc. So, for example, Adam Crawford talks about the idea of independent interdependence, because there's dangers to co-production if they're too closely tied to organizational interests, and they can lose their vital critical distance and become an arm of or a justification for prevailing practices, rather than an engine of critical reflection and organizational learning. So Alistair Henry's work is also helpful here in terms of talking about the importance of reflexivity in research and in police collaborators. So critical research should be welcomed, not feared, in challenging the status quo and practice. And the idea here is that boundaries and reflection, acts as a healthy reminder of the importance of independence. So academic research is only valuable precisely because it tests police communities of practice and existing knowledge and status quo. So essentially there are some core dilemmas here in terms of control and critical distance. You should never be asked to change your findings. If you're doing a kind of no surprises approach, or you've been working quite closely, you may be looking at factual accuracy checks from partners. It can be a challenge to be critical and independent whilst also being constructive and collaborating with partners and potentially sometimes receiving funding for them. And speaking truth to power isn't easy, but it's our duty. And in my experience, having a seat at the table and building relationships can help with being heard. The impact of building relationships is that you're more likely to be approached, consulted, and listened to. But there's a danger of becoming too much of an insider. So we must continually reflect on that and put measures in place to guard against it. And I think values are important here in terms of underpinning how you operate. For example, at SIPR, we have collaborative, independent and analytical, inclusive, transparent, innovative and supportive. But these need to also be underpinned by governance processes. So just onto the final slide, as I finish, I would just argue that in order to bring real change, which I think is why we're all here, we need to extend partnerships, even more broadly in our work, engaging with civil society, government, policy circles, non-governmental organizations, people with lived and living experience on the issues that we're concerned with, and focusing on public engagement and the role of informed public debate here is really important. And I think for this audience, maybe it is worth reflecting on what values are important to you and to the ECR community in criminology in Scotland. So whilst we really need to push for change, I'm also a big believer in think big, start small. So just start somewhere and try. But within this, I think we also need to remember to be kind to each other. So there's a role for everyone. We need people with a seat at the table, and we need people shouting from the outside. So, speak truth to power, criticize and question, but be constructive where possible. And I think it's all about relationships and kindness to ourselves and others. So we need to remember that we can't all be everything or to everyone all of the time. Thank you. That's me.